You didn't blink. That's the part no one sees. Something happened when no one was watching and you stayed on your feet. You didn't announce it. You didn't ask for permission. You didn't make a sound. You just kept going. There was a moment, maybe quiet, maybe ordinary, when something inside you shifted. Not dramatically, not cleanly. It tightened, and you carried on. You didn't collapse when the pressure started to stack. You didn't fall apart when the weight settled in your chest. You didn't reach for comfort in front of witnesses. You absorbed it. Whatever was meant to erase you didn't. It didn't win. You outlived it. And you didn't celebrate that either. You simply moved forward while something in you hardened. You already know what I mean. You see it in the small things, the way you delay the hard task until tomorrow. Not because you're lazy, because part of you is tired of pushing. The way you scroll when you know you should be building. Just a few minutes, you tell yourself, just enough to quiet the noise. The way you negotiate with discipline. I'll start later. I'll fix it next week. I deserve a break. The way you break small promises to yourself. Not the big ones, just the quiet ones no one else hears. The way you sit in silence after disappointment instead of reacting. Not exploding, not explaining, just going still. None of this is accidental. These are adaptations. This is what endurance looks like when it doesn't perform. You didn't become this way overnight. You learned to hold things. You learned to swallow words. You learned to keep your face neutral while something pressed against your ribs. You learned to function while carrying questions that never got answered. You learned to keep moving even when motivation disappeared. That's the cost. Not pain, containment. You don't talk about it. You just wake up. You just show up. You just do what needs to be done. Even when you don't feel aligned, even when you don't feel seen, even when part of you wants to stop negotiating with the world altogether. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being composed too long, from choosing restraint over reaction, from letting moments pass because explaining yourself feels heavier than staying quiet. You know that exhaustion. You live with it. And still, you didn't break. You adjusted. You became quieter, more internal, more selective. You stopped giving everything an answer. You started letting things sit. People assume nothing is happening when you go silent. They don't feel the pressure moving inside you. They don't feel the calculations. They don't feel the slow tightening of standards. But you do. You feel it when you pause instead of responding. You feel it when you walk away from distractions without making a scene. You feel it when you catch yourself before old habits take over. Behavior, cost, excuse. You delay. It costs momentum. You tell yourself you'll recover later. You distract yourself. It costs clarity. You tell yourself you need relief. You avoid confrontation. It costs honesty. You tell yourself it isn't worth it. And every time, something inside you watches, quietly. You are already inside this moment. You didn't arrive here by accident. This isn't inspiration. This isn't motivation. This is recognition. There's a version of you that didn't survive by being loud. It survived by staying contained, by adapting, by learning when not to speak, by learning when not to react, by learning how to carry weight without asking for acknowledgement. You don't need to be told what this is. You can feel it. Leaving right now would feel strange, like walking away from something unfinished, like pretending you didn't hear your own internal voice clear its throat. Because somewhere along the way, something in you crossed a line, and it doesn't go back. You keep carrying it. That's what most people don't notice. They see that you're still moving. They assume that means you're fine. But what they don't feel is the accumulation. The way weight doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in pieces. A disappointment here, a delay there, another responsibility added quietly to your list. Nothing dramatic, just enough to change your posture. You learned to absorb things. That's the skill you developed. Not resilience in the way people like to celebrate it. Absorption. You learned how to take pressure without announcing it. You learned how to swallow frustration and keep your voice even. You learned how to nod when something felt wrong. You learned how to keep showing up when you were already tired. That's the behavior. You wake up, you move, you complete what's in front of you, even when your body feels heavy, even when your mind feels dull. You keep showing up while exhausted. The internal cost comes later. It comes as numbness, not sadness, numbness. You don't feel things the same way anymore. You don't react the same way. You don't celebrate small wins. Your shoulders carry more than they used to. Your breathing gets shallower without you noticing. Your patience becomes mechanical. And when you catch it, when you feel that weight settling deeper into your muscles, you tell yourself the same thing every time. This is just how life is. That's the excuse. Not dramatic, not self-pitying, just practical. You say it like it explains everything. You say it like it closes the case, but it doesn't. It just keeps you functional. You've become very good at being functional. You know how to move through days without making noise. You know how to answer messages even when you don't feel present. You know how to sit through conversations while your attention is somewhere deeper. You know how to delay your own needs. Behavior. You postpone rest. You postpone honesty. You postpone decisions that would change things. Internal cost. Your body remembers. Your nervous system keeps a quiet record. Excuse. Now isn't the time. And then you continue. This is how it compounds. You don't collapse, you adjust. You don't complain, you compensate. You don't ask for space, you compress yourself into whatever shape is required. You became reliable. That's what people see. You became the one who handles it, the one who doesn't overreact, the one who keeps things together. They lean on that. They depend on that. They start to assume it's effortless. And somewhere along the way, you become misunderstood. Not in an obvious way, in a subtle way. They misunderstand your silence for stability. They misunderstand your control for comfort. They misunderstand your restraint for lack of need. You're underestimated because you don't perform your struggle. You're relied upon because you don't display your limits. You become the steady one, the calm one, the composed one. And that role settles on you, not because you asked for it, because you didn't resist it. You learned that being expressive made things complicated, so you became efficient instead. You learned that showing emotion invited questions, so you learned to contain it. You learned that vulnerability slowed things down, so you became precise. Functional instead of expressive, reliable instead of visible, controlled instead of comforted. That's the exchange. You didn't sign anything, you just adapted. You still feel things. Of course you do. You just process them privately. You let disappointment pass through you without broadcasting it. You let frustration settle into your jaw. You let fatigue live in your lower back. You let grief become quiet. You let anger dissolve into discipline. Behavior. You stay composed. Internal cost. Your inner world gets smaller. Excuse. This is what maturity looks like. You say that when you choose not to speak. You say that when you swallow words. You say that when you walk away from moments that deserve attention. And every time you move a little further inside yourself, you become harder to reach, not for others, for you. I learned this the hard way, and then I watched you do the same thing. You didn't need to be taught. Life taught you. Pressure taught you. Responsibility taught you. Being needed taught you. Being overlooked taught you. You learned to keep your reactions contained. You learned to sit with discomfort. You learned to carry things without asking who put them on your shoulders. You learned to make yourself smaller in moments that required endurance, not because you're weak, because you're capable. And capability attracts weight. People don't hand burdens to the fragile. They hand them to the ones who don't drop them. So you keep receiving tasks, expectations, silence. You become the quiet structure holding things together, and no one thinks to check how much strain the structure is under because it hasn't cracked. Behavior. You keep moving. Internal cost. You stop noticing how tired you are. Excuse. I've handled worse. You've said that. Maybe not out loud, but you've said it. You've compared today's pressure to yesterday's survival. You've minimized your current weight by remembering past pain, and that comparison keeps you going. It also keeps you compressed. You don't talk about how heavy it feels to always be the stable one. You don't talk about how lonely it is to be dependable. You don't talk about how strange it feels to be surrounded and still unseen. Because talking about it would require slowing down, and slowing down feels dangerous. So you remain controlled. You remain measured. You remain steady. And inside that steadiness, something keeps reorganizing. Your standards get sharper. Your tolerance gets narrower. Your patience becomes intentional. You start choosing silence more often. You start walking away sooner. You stop explaining yourself, not out of bitterness, out of efficiency. You didn't become stronger loudly. You didn't announce your endurance. You didn't mark milestones. You didn't ask for recognition. You became quieter, and in that quiet, you learned exactly how much you can carry without making a sound. You feel it before you name it, not as emotion, as pressure. It's there when you wake up. It's there when the room is quiet. It's there in the pauses between tasks. You don't talk about it. You learn not to, because the moment you try, it turns into something else. So instead, you carry it. That's the pattern. You carry things that don't have language. You carry what doesn't fit into conversation. You carry what would slow everything down if you let it surface. This is the tension, not between good and bad, between who you are and who you've had to become. You move through your days with a controlled posture. You answer when spoken to. You complete what's expected. You don't make scenes. But inside, there is compression, anger that doesn't get released, ambition that doesn't get announced, grief that doesn't get shared. You learned how to fold it inward. Behavior. You avoid confrontation. You let comments pass. You swallow words that would change the temperature of a room. You nod when something feels wrong. You redirect when something feels personal. You choose quiet over friction. That's what people see. What they don't see is what it costs. Internal cost. Your nights get restless, not dramatic, just light sleep. Waking up already tired. Your jaw stays tight longer than it should. Your chest holds tension even when nothing is happening. Your thoughts circle back to moments you didn't address, conversations you edited, decisions you postponed. And every time you feel that pressure rise, you give yourself the same explanation. It's not worth it. That's the excuse, not cowardice, efficiency. You tell yourself the outcome wouldn't change enough to justify the energy. You tell yourself peace is more important than being right. You tell yourself it's better to conserve than to engage. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes that sentence becomes a hiding place. Behavior. You disengage. Internal cost. The pressure stays. Excuse. It's not worth it. And then you keep going. This is how it builds, not explosively, gradually, layer by layer. You don't release emotion, you store it. You don't vent, you archive. You don't lash out, you compress. That's your skill. That's what you've mastered. You've learned how to keep rage contained, not as chaos, as energy. Held, directed inward. You've learned how to discipline desire, not suppress it, discipline it. You don't chase every impulse. You don't say everything you think. You don't move every time you feel restless. You wait, you observe, you calculate. People mistake that for passivity. They see silence and assume absence. They see restraint and assume weakness. They don't feel what's happening under the surface. They don't feel the accumulation. You do. You feel it when you sit alone after long days. You feel it when your body finally slows down and your mind doesn't. You feel it in the quiet moments when there's nothing to distract you. That's when it gets loud. Not in sound, in density. You carry anger that never had a place to go. Not rage, anger, clean, focused, unexpressed. You carry ambition that you don't broadcast because broadcasting attracts interference. You carry grief that doesn't ask for witnesses because explaining it would require reopening things you've already learned to contain. Behavior. You keep things inside. Internal cost. Your inner world grows heavy. Excuse. This is just how I'm wired. You've said that. Maybe not exactly like that, but you've used some version of it. You've normalized your own compression. You've told yourself this is maturity. This is control. This is being composed. And in many ways it is, but it's also preparation. You didn't explode. You condensed. You didn't fall apart. You consolidated. You didn't spill emotion everywhere. You learned how to hold it. You held it. You held it. You held it. Every time you wanted to speak and didn't. Every time you wanted to react and paused. Every time you wanted to walk away and stayed long enough to finish what mattered. You held it. That repetition matters, because holding is not nothing. Holding takes strength. Holding takes awareness. Holding requires a nervous system that can tolerate pressure without discharging it impulsively. That's not accidental, that's trained. Restraint became your default, not because someone told you to be restrained, because life demanded it. Silence became armor, not because you wanted to disappear, because silence kept you intact. You learned when to engage. You learned when to retreat. You learned when to let things pass. You learned how to sit with discomfort without needing to resolve it immediately. Behavior. You delay confrontation. Internal cost. The tension stays in your body. Excuse. Timing matters. And then you wait. You've spent years learning how to stay composed while carrying unresolved weight. Years learning how to maintain functionality under internal pressure. Years learning how to be steady while things inside you reorganized. This isn't stagnation, it's compression. Pressure doesn't just build for no reason. Pressure changes structure. It hardens edges. It clarifies priorities. It teaches you what matters enough to protect. And slowly, quietly, you started becoming selective. You stopped wasting words. You stopped chasing validation. You stopped explaining yourself to people who weren't listening. Not dramatically, practically. You began conserving energy. You began choosing your battles. You began letting silence do work that arguments never could. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal. From the inside, it feels like alignment. You were never passive. You were preparing. You were learning how much pressure you could hold without breaking. You were discovering where your limits actually are. You were refining your control, not to dominate others, to stabilize yourself. And that changes everything. Because once you realize that restraint is power, once you understand that silence can be deliberate, once you feel how much force you've been containing, you stop seeing your past behavior as avoidance. You see it for what it was: training. Quiet, uncelebrated training. You didn't explode. You condensed. And now you know exactly what you're carrying and why. You wait longer than you should. Not because you're unsure, because some part of you still remembers what it was like to want to be understood. You don't say that out loud, but it shows up in small ways, in how you reread messages before sending them, in how you soften your tone when you don't need to, in how you explain decisions that don't require permission. That's the residue. Not weakness, residue, from a time when recognition mattered more than alignment. Behavior. You look for acknowledgement. You wait for someone to notice what you've been carrying. You hold back action until there's a signal, a nod, a sign, some external confirmation that you're not moving alone. Internal cost, hesitation, second guessing, that subtle pause before commitment. You feel it when you almost speak, then don't, when you almost act, then wait. Your momentum gets interrupted by the need to be seen. Excuse. People need to understand. You've told yourself that. You've believed it. You framed it as clarity, as communication, as being reasonable. But underneath it was something quieter. You didn't want approval. You wanted safety. You wanted assurance that your direction wouldn't isolate you. So you explained, you clarified, you justified, you translated your instincts into language other people could accept. And every time you did that, something small was traded away. Not dignity, autonomy. You felt it, even if you couldn't name it. Every explanation took energy. Every defense diluted conviction. Every attempt to be understood asked you to slow down for people who weren't moving at your pace. Behavior. You kept trying to bring others with you. Internal cost. Your own clarity started to wobble. Excuse. If they get it, things will be easier. But they didn't, and they weren't. They questioned. They misunderstood. They projected. They interpreted your restraint as uncertainty. They interpreted your silence as absence. And you kept adjusting, kept rephrasing, kept offering context. Until one day, something in you got tired. Not angry, tired. Tired of translating your internal decisions into external language. Tired of waiting for recognition before honoring your own direction. Tired of performing coherence for people who weren't listening. This is where it shifted. Quietly. No announcement, no dramatic moment. Just a small internal click. You stopped correcting misunderstandings. Not out of spite, out of efficiency. You stopped proving alignment, because alignment doesn't need witnesses. You stopped performing clarity, because clarity is internal. Behavior. You let conversations end without resolution. Internal cost. At first, discomfort. The awkward silence after you don't explain. The unfamiliar feeling of not tying things up neatly. Excuse. It's not worth reopening. And this time, it was true. You began leaving space where you used to fill it. You let people hold incomplete stories about you. You let assumptions sit where explanations once lived. You noticed how much energy that freed, how much time returned to you, how much lighter decisions felt when they weren't filtered through external approval. This wasn't rebellion. There was no defiance in it, just detachment. You realized something simple. Respect isn't requested, it's detected. People feel it before they understand it. They sense it in how you move, in how you don't rush, in how you don't over-explain, in how you don't chase agreement. You didn't become colder, you became quieter. You stopped volunteering your inner process. You stopped narrating your evolution. You started letting outcomes speak. Behavior. You disengage instead of debate. Internal cost. At first, the urge to clarify still shows up. Old habits don't vanish overnight. Excuse. They might get the wrong idea. Quiet confrontation. You let them, because their ideas don't direct your path anymore. You began practicing selective withdrawal, not disappearing, choosing. Choosing where your attention goes, choosing which conversations deserve your energy, choosing when silence is more accurate than speech. You leave threads unfinished. You allow pauses to stretch. You don't rush to repair every misunderstanding. You don't rush to correct every assumption. And something stabilizes. You feel it in your body. The reduction of noise, the absence of that constant internal commentary. You no longer need to be witnessed to be certain. You no longer need agreement to proceed. You no longer need to be understood to stay aligned. This is psychological independence, not isolation, autonomy. You didn't rebel, you disengaged, and in that disengagement, you reclaimed something that had been slowly leaking away. Your direction, your pace, your authority. Not over others, over yourself. And that changes how everything feels. You move differently now, not faster, cleaner, less reactive,
more precise. You don't announce boundaries, you embody them. You don't explain your silence, you let it stand. You don't ask for respect, you allow it to emerge. Or not. Either way, you keep moving. This is the pivot, the moment approval lost its authority, not because you fought it, because you stopped feeding it. And what remains is simple. You act when it's time. You speak when it matters. You withdraw when it doesn't. You don't rebel, you disengage, and you don't look back.
You stopped fighting the wrong battles before you even realized that's what you were doing. Not all at once, quietly, in pieces. You used to react to everything, every comment, every delay, every slight, every message that felt off, every look that lingered too long. You told yourself it mattered. You told yourself you had to respond. You told yourself silence meant weakness. So you answered. You explained. You defended. You clarified. You stepped back into situations that were already draining you. That was the behavior, reaction, impulse, automatic engagement. And every time you did it, something small left you. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else could see, just a little more of your attention, a little more of your focus, a little more of your patience, scattered across conversations that led nowhere, arguments that changed nothing, emotions that didn't deserve your presence. That was the cost. Scattered energy, fragmented thought, a mind that never fully rested because it was always preparing the next reply, always replaying the last exchange, always holding tension in places you didn't even notice anymore. You told yourself you were just being responsible. You told yourself you were standing up for yourself. You told yourself you couldn't let things slide. But underneath that excuse was something quieter. You didn't like unresolved things. You didn't like being misunderstood. You didn't like the feeling of someone else having the last word. So you stayed involved, even when it drained you, even when it kept you small, even when it pulled you back into cycles you had already outgrown. Then something shifted. Not dramatically, not with a speech. You just stopped stepping into every fire. You stopped treating every provocation like a summons. You stopped letting other people's urgency decide your pace. At first, it felt uncomfortable. There was space where noise used to be. There were gaps where reactions used to live. You would see the message and not answer right away. You would hear the comment and not respond. You would notice the tension and let it sit. You let things expire. You let people misunderstand. You let moments pass without inserting yourself. That was new, and it felt wrong for a while. Your nervous system still wanted motion. Your habits still wanted engagement. There was a reflex to explain, to correct, to prove, to close every loop. But you didn't. You watched it rise. You felt the impulse, and you didn't obey it. That's when you started to understand something. Most battles aren't invitations. They're distractions. They don't take your strength all at once. They take it in fragments, through notifications, through side conversations, through emotional detours, through the need to be seen as right. You had been spending your power on things that couldn't return it, and you had been calling that participation. You had been calling that presence, but it was just leakage. So you withdrew, not loudly, not with announcements. You simply stopped showing up to chaos. You stopped feeding noise. You stopped rehearsing arguments in your head. You stopped preparing explanations for people who weren't listening. You stopped chasing closure in places that only offered friction. That's when stillness stopped feeling empty. It started feeling full. Non-participation became your advantage. Absence became your authority. You didn't need to dominate conversations. You didn't need to win every exchange.
You didn't need to be understood by everyone in real time. You realized something simple. If it costs your clarity, it costs too much. If it pulls you into emotional waste, it isn't worth your presence. If it demands reaction instead of thought, it isn't aligned with where you're going. So you stepped back. You conserved. You chose where your attention went. You let silence do the work you used to force with words. And something unexpected happened. Your mind became quieter. Your body felt steadier. Decisions came faster because there was less interference. You stopped carrying other people's moods. You stopped absorbing their urgency. You stopped letting their chaos leak into your inner space. Behavior changed. Internal cost dropped. The old excuse faded. You no longer told yourself you had to respond. You saw it for what it was, a habit, a reflex, a way of staying busy instead of staying centered. You didn't become cold. You became selective. You didn't detach from life. You detached from noise. You didn't lose empathy. You stopped wasting it. And slowly, without ceremony, your energy began returning to you. Not in bursts, not in spikes, in steady, quiet increments. Back into your breath, back into your posture, back into your choices, back into the things that actually move your life forward. You weren't fighting anymore. You were conserving. You weren't proving anymore. You were holding. You weren't reacting anymore. You were present. And in that stillness, you finally felt it. Your energy coming back home.
You didn't become disciplined. You removed everything that wasn't. That's the part no one tells you. It didn't arrive as motivation. It didn't feel inspiring. It showed up as repetition, as quiet mornings, as choices no one noticed. You started building without witnesses, not because it felt powerful, because it felt necessary. At first, it was awkward. You would wake up earlier than you wanted to. You would move when your body asked to stay still. You would sit with work while your mind searched for escape. That was the behavior. Daily construction, small actions, stacked. No audience, no immediate reward, just you and the routine. And there was a cost. Loneliness. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that shows up when everyone else is asleep, when your phone stays silent, when there's no feedback loop to tell you you're doing it right. You would look around and see nothing changing fast enough. You would finish a session and feel no surge, no applause, just tiredness. And that's when the excuse would surface. No one sees this anyway. You told yourself it didn't matter. You told yourself you could ease up. You told yourself consistency without recognition was pointless. That was the old reflex, looking outward, waiting for evidence, waiting for confirmation. But you didn't stop. You kept showing up, even when it felt empty, even when it felt repetitive, even when it felt like you were moving in place. You started to understand something. Solitude wasn't punishment, it was refinement. It stripped away performance. It removed the need to impress. It forced you to confront your habits without distraction. You learned to sit in silence without reaching for comfort. You learned to work without needing praise. You learned to move without needing a mood. Routine became your structure, not rigid, reliable. It carried you on days when your energy dipped. It made decisions for you when your mind wanted to negotiate. You didn't wake up asking how you felt. You woke up knowing what needed to be done. That's when consistency stopped feeling boring. It started feeling dangerous. Dangerous to the version of you that used to wait. Dangerous to the patterns that depended on delay. Dangerous to the comfort rituals that kept you soft. You began noticing your impulses. The urge to scroll, the urge to postpone, the urge to reward yourself early. And instead of fighting them loudly, you redirected quietly. You closed the app. You returned to the task. You drank water instead of reaching for distraction. Small acts, repeated. That was the behavior. Building quietly, every day. The cost was still there. Isolation didn't disappear. There were evenings when you ate alone, mornings when the world felt distant, moments when you wondered if anyone would ever understand what you were becoming. And again, the excuse tried to enter. No one sees this anyway. But this time, it landed differently. You didn't need anyone to see it. You could feel it. In your posture, in your breathing, in how quickly you recovered from setbacks, in how little you needed external input to stay on course. Internal alignment replaced external momentum. You weren't chasing energy anymore. You were generating stability. You stopped negotiating with your future. You honored your schedule even when your mood resisted. You prepared when it would have been easier to rest. You chose long-term direction over short-term relief. Early mornings became normal, not heroic, normal. You moved before the noise started.
You gave your best hours to your priorities instead of your distractions. You controlled what you consumed, not just food, information, conversations, environments. You became selective with your attention. That changed everything. Unseen preparation became your advantage. While others waited to feel ready, you were already in motion. While others looked for motivation, you followed commitment. You didn't need intensity to start. You needed structure. You didn't need hype to continue. You needed continuity. You didn't need to feel powerful. You needed to be consistent. And slowly, your identity began to shift, not in how you spoke, in how you acted. You stopped announcing plans. You started completing them. You stopped seeking validation. You started tracking progress. You stopped romanticizing struggle. You respected process. Behavior, cost, excuse, confrontation. Each cycle made you quieter, more precise, more contained. You didn't become rigid. You became dependable to yourself. That was the real transformation. You learned to trust your own follow-through. You learned that discipline isn't intensity, it's agreement. An agreement you keep with yourself, especially when no one is watching. You stopped asking if today mattered. You treated every day like a deposit. Some were small, some were heavier. All of them counted. And now you don't wait to feel ready. You don't wait for perfect conditions. You don't wait for confidence to arrive. You move, because that's who you are now. You stopped reacting, not because it felt righteous, not because you wanted to be different, because the noise no longer demanded it. You felt the pull at first, the interruptions, the delays, the constant provocation, the excuses you once clung to. It's easier this way. You accepted them quietly. And then you realized you didn't need to answer. You didn't need to justify. You didn't need to chase resolution. The patterns that once shook you, they passed through. Your attention was no longer borrowed. You observed without participation. The momentary spikes of irritation came and went. Your nervous system stabilized. Your breath measured itself. Your pulse found rhythm. The chaos lost its power over you. The urge to react, the urge to interrupt, the urge to defend, they were still there, but you let them hover. You didn't engage. You didn't argue. You didn't explain. You didn't need to. The internal cost was obvious. Isolation, time spent apart from familiar responses, absence where once there was presence. And yet, you were not diminished. You were not absent. You were intentionally removed. You discovered the value in silence, strategic quiet, not avoidance, not weakness, a deliberate space between stimulus and action. Your decisions slowed, measured, considered. Your responses became scarce, not random. Every choice carried weight, not because you were heavy-handed, because you were grounded. Your presence deepened. It settled. It drew attention without effort. It conveyed authority without words. People noticed the lack of urgency. They felt the gravity of someone who doesn't rush, the gravity of someone who doesn't explain, the gravity of someone whose attention is no longer for sale. Moments of tension no longer pierced you. You moved through life as a quiet center, unshaken by small storms, unmoved by minor provocations. The old reflexes, the rapid responses, the compulsive explanations, they lost their meaning. You understood that restraint itself was power, that absence of reaction carried authority no noise could replicate. And still, there were costs. Times when your distance was misunderstood. Times when your silence was mistaken for weakness. Times when the world pressed in, seeking proof of your presence. And yet, you remained, unmoved, unperturbed. You became difficult to disturb, not through aggression, not through intimidation, not through performance, through stillness, through measured attention, through deliberate containment. Your internal landscape was no longer reactive. It was sovereign. Your boundaries clear, your priorities intact. Every choice was calibrated, every interaction intentional. You observed patterns rather than being caught in them. The pull of expectation lost its hold. The sway of judgment no longer reached you. You carried a quiet dominance, invisible to those who demanded spectacle, visible only to those attuned to depth. You didn't need to be loud anymore. You didn't need to convince. You didn't need to explain. Your presence alone carried the weight of authority. The world continued its noise, and you remained undisturbed, because you had become the observer, the still point, because you had learned that mastery begins in the silence between impulse and action, because you no longer reacted, you existed, complete, measured, certain. You didn't need to be loud anymore, and that was enough. You didn't blink, not once, not when it tested you, not when the days stretched empty without notice, not when your own mind argued, distracted, delayed, whispered excuses you once believed. You endured. Through the pauses that felt too long, through the commitments you broke quietly on yourself, through the rituals that gave nothing but rhythm. You endured without applause, without acknowledgement, without certainty that it mattered to anyone but you. You refined, in the spaces no one watched, in the moments you wished you were somewhere else, in the mornings that arrived before the world stirred, in the silences you carried like weight. Not a triumph, not a display, not a performance, only clarity. The noise that once consumed you faded. The need to justify evaporated. You no longer negotiate with your own impulses. You no longer seek permission from others. Your choices are yours alone, unhurried, measured, entire. Your presence is not loud. It does not shout. It does not prove. It does not seek validation. It exists. It occupies space. It anchors. It observes. And in that stillness, you understand. The lessons you absorbed, the costs you paid, they are folded into the very core of you. They are neither regrets nor trophies. They are proof, quiet, unseen, irrevocable. You didn't become something new. You remembered who you were, and you stayed. Through all the distractions, the delays, the broken promises, through all the moments you could have abandoned yourself, you stayed. Not out of defiance, not out of stubbornness, but because there was no other way to move through what you were given. You stand in quiet authority, not reaching, not proving, not reacting. You exist, full, measured, certain. The world continues its rhythm, its demands, its urgencies, and yet here you remain, immovable, calm, aligned. This is what remains, the space you claimed without spectacle, the gravity that came not from force but from presence, the clarity that demands nothing, the authority that asks no permission, and finally, the truth you carry quietly. You didn't need to become more. You didn't need to conquer. You didn't need to rise. You remembered, and you stayed. This is what remains.